So tonight Dennis is going to be speaking on the topic of food production and the environment. And so please join me in welcoming someone that I'm pleased to call a friend of the Marquis Project, Dennis Cunningham.
So thanks very much for inviting me to this presentation, or make this presentation this evening. I'm hoping to have a very interesting and engaging discussion with everyone here about food production and climate change from two perspectives, the international perspective and the local perspective. What I'd like to do is talk for about 10 minutes on kind of international issues related to agriculture, and globally speaking, and how they interact with climate change. And then spend about 20 minutes or so just having a little bit of a dialogue around some of those issues and points of intersection with the work that the Marquis Project does. And then take that discussion and tie it into sort of what's happening locally, I guess in Manitoba, but speaking locally is in kind of a North American context for the way climate change and agricultural systems are interacting and being affected by what's anticipated to occur through the result of climate change. Over the last 100 years, we've seen globalization change the way the agricultural economy operates. We've moved from small-scale farms producing for kind of local needs to something that's more globally interconnected, and seen a shift to large-scale monoculture. In fact, wheat, rice, and corn are now the most abundant plants on Earth. We are massive consumers of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. The energy used for agriculture is fossil fuel based, not just photosynthetic like it used to be, our reliance on. Sort of the fossil fuels to produce crops is significant and growing. And a lot of what's happening is in those changes are caused because of subsidization by national governments. The way our agricultural system is based on sort of a high level of subsidization doesn't reflect the actual cost of production as it's passed on to the consumer. We've also seen, because of these shifts in the way our agricultural systems formed, changes in diet across cultures. So for instance, in Asia, the consumption of meat has skyrocketed. And all these changes have implications in the way greenhouse gas emissions are generated by agriculture and emitted into the atmosphere. So the face of actually another aspect of that that causes increased GHG emissions is the fact that food now travels thousands of kilometers typically to reach our plates. So the face of agriculture isn't what it used to be 3 or 4 generations ago. We don't, for the most part, recognize those changes because of a significant disconnect that's occurred in our urban areas around how food is produced and how it reaches our tables. But climate change is beginning to force us to rethink what agricultural systems are, how they're developed, and what and how we interact or relate to agricultural production. So first, we're seeing an increased vulnerability of food to the expected changes in our climate. Food systems have 4 components. This is sort of looking at it from an ecological footprint perspective. So croplands, which make up about 50% or just over 50% of what we call the ecological footprint of agriculture. And there's pastures, fisheries, and energy. Now, all of those components are vulnerable to climate change. Croplands are vulnerable for a variety of reasons. Monocultures are very susceptible to disease and pests. Climate change and sort of the anticipated changes that climate models are indicating will exacerbate the spread of pests, just simply because of changing patterns of precipitation, changing sort of degree temperature days, and so that's one potential impact. Pasture is for the same way. We will see Again, precipitation affects sort of the quality of pasture land and how it's used by farmers, where pasture can be used as a buffer for heavy rainfall, but when we have other sort of processes directing moisture off the land, pasture becomes sort of not quite as useful as it once was. Fisheries are impacted by climate change because of warming oceans and acidification of oceans. Overfishing in general has exacerbated the ability of fisheries to rebound from the other stresses that climate change bring to them. As I said, sort of the acidification and warming of the oceans. And energy in general is just sort of continually relied upon as the feedstock for our agricultural systems. So we use fossil fuels to create artificial, I'm drawing a blank here, artificial fertilizers. We rely on artificial pesticides and moved away from sort of the use of natural processes for fertilization and replenishing the nutrients in our soils. And because of monoculture, we are more reliant on pesticides to control pests that have the ability to really impact the crops that we grow, The other thing is because of the increase in meat production and consumption, and sort of stats over the last few years have indicated that we've seen about a 60% increase in meat consumption. You get sort of a corresponding increase in the emissions from livestock operations, and with the primary emission being methane, which is 21 times more potent than CO2, so it stays in the atmosphere much longer, has a deeper impact on the climate system in general. Now, one of the responses that comes out of sort of this the discussion around meat consumption and its impact on the climate through the sort of the use of fossil fuels to grow meat, but also the emissions from the livestock production, is to reduce intake of meat, reduce our dietary intake. That, in fact, has become sort of more of a mainstream argument in that sort of some leading economists, Nicholas Stern, who's a UK-based economist, wrote a very influential report on the cost of climate change globally. If we don't respond to it, then our economic systems will take a certain hit. The longer we take in addressing climate change, the higher the cost increases. He said that people should start switching to sort of going one meal a week without meat to reduce the consumption of meat and the greenhouse gas emissions related to that. Now, globally, it's estimated that food systems in general use about 10% of fossil fuels consumed globally every year, and this includes the energy for fertilizers and pesticides, but also in irrigation and post-production. And in fact, the majority of that 10%, about 80 to 90% of that, is used in post-production. So a lot of times when people look at sort of the impact, they tend to look at the front end of agriculture. So that's where the issue is. It's sort of coming off the land, when in fact it's the processing. Because we've moved from sort of a diet where fresh produce, fresh goods were part of kind of the local agricultural system, to something where there's an increased level of processing involved in getting products to the table. You see the shift of energy going into that end of it. There was an interesting fact in one of the articles I was reading in preparing for this that was saying that a can of corn is estimated to contain about 6 times the actual energy in the processing than it does in the corn that you end up consuming out of the corn. Or the other way of looking at it is that here in North America, it takes about 7 units of fossil fuel energy to produce 1 unit of food energy. So there's a huge imbalance in the way we produce food these days. The concept of fair miles and looking at the bigger picture of how food is grown, what it means for livelihoods in the countries that it's grown in. Is it representing an economic development opportunity for communities that wouldn't otherwise have economic development opportunities? And then saying, if it is being shipped long distances, what type of shipping is being used? Is it an energy-intensive shipping process like air travel? Because certainly in Europe, and the UK specifically, where this fair miles concept is originated, a significant majority of food that comes into the UK is flown by air carrier. So it has a higher proportion of energy being devoted to the transportation. Here in North America, we rely more on trucking as well as coastal shipping to get food from location to location. When you start looking at it like that, it's still, I guess, doesn't bring in some of the issues around quality and concerns around, again, the monoculture, where the best product for our food system, the way it's set up right now, is one that travels well, not necessarily one that is grown because it tastes better or because it'll sort of be something that's preferred by the consumer that's well informed. It's because it can get from point A to point B and ripen on the way, or sort of be able to manage the bumping and banging without showing a lot of bruising and that type of thing. So that's another sort of aspect of the food system that still needs to be worked on. From a food or a fair miles perspective, the idea is some crops are grown in the location or the environment where they're best suited to be grown, and because of that, they are less energy intensive. I mean, in the winter, we can grow tomatoes and strawberries here in Manitoba, but we do it in greenhouses that requires the use of natural gas to heat those greenhouses. And when you start looking at the equation, then it ends up being not something that has it may still be local, but it still has a greenhouse gas footprint that's significant. And studies, out of the UK have shown that goods that are actually grown in Africa and shipped over to the UK still result in almost the exact same level of GHG emissions as something that would be grown in the UK. Now the response, the counter response to that type of, okay, here's what we're going to do is, why are you eating strawberries out of season? Why have we lost kind of the seasonal pattern of our diet as well? And in part, I think climate change and some of the anticipated impacts of climate change will start moving us back into that seasonality, where we'll realize that the way our food system brings food to us isn't conducive to some of the changes and impacts that we'll see in California and Mexico, where the water aquifers in California and some of the main growing regions are almost completely depleted, and they aren't being replenished by rainfall because it's just not returning. And so we're going to have to adapt because of those types of impacts in a food system where the chain is further down the way from where we are. And so we're going to move because we're forced to move. Now, I think the other part of sort of the fair miles approach that is equally important is in sort of the development and ethical considerations. So I touched on kind of the economic development aspects where there are communities, and I think fair trade coffee and some of those products are an excellent example of products that have created economic development opportunities and have been driven by the producers, and there's more of sort of the revenue going back to the producers because of the way the system is shifting. Now, the ethical considerations around fair miles have to do with even if there is a slight imbalance in the way the greenhouse gas emissions are generated because a crop is grown in Mexico and shipped up to Canada, why do we have to look so harshly on kind of a country like Mexico or Kenya or another country that hasn't been responsible for the bulk of the emissions that have been generated over the last 100 years that are now causing the problem? And so it becomes kind of an area where when we start restricting the trade in an agricultural good because we think that the greenhouse gas emissions are a negative aspect of its production, we overlook kind of an ethical obligation that we have to those countries and those producers to allow them to develop their markets and sort of see some economic benefit where they haven't been able to gain economic benefit in the past. In North American or developed world food systems, they're managed by kind of a consolidated set of companies. There's about a dozen companies that really control food production globally, and market it to the bulk of individuals in the developed world. We don't get the chance to have a lot of control over how we're purchasing our food. And so again, this food miles and fair miles concept allows consumers to be a little bit more aware of, again, source of food, the ethical issues around food production in developing countries, the way that food is brought into our grocery stores and food systems, and sort of allows you to make some adjustments or better informed purchasing decisions. The other thing around, again, sort of get back into the climate change aspect of this conversation, the developing countries and developing world has two disadvantages. Typically, it will be most impacted by climate change and will feel those impacts sort of to a greater extent because they don't have the robust infrastructure and financial systems to allow them to respond to climate change impacts and sort of significant weather shifts or weather pattern shifts. And so by providing, again, sort of a framework that allows for economic development in those areas, then we do create something that gives them the capacity to begin to adapt and respond to anticipated climate changes. So while it seems like it might be kind of a meandering approach to get to an endpoint, there is still positive benefit to looking more closely at where our food comes from and not necessarily restricting it to kind of the local. We need to rely on local sources for our food because there are other implications when we begin to do that.